My daughter-in-law emptied my late wife's savings account. She did it while I was sitting at the hospital signing discharge papers. When I found out, I didn't say a word. 3 days later, I handed her an envelope. She thought it was the deed to our vacation cabin in the Smokies. She smiled at me for the first time in 2 years and said, "I knew you'd come around, Dad." Then she opened it. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to Sincere Event Stories and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are. It helps more than you know. I was 63 years old when my wife, Carol. No, I need to stop there. I've been calling her by her name in my head for 40 years. I'll call her my wife here, because that's what she was. Everything. 41 years. She was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's in the spring of 2022, and by that November, she needed full-time help. We had a plan. We'd always had a plan. She was meticulous that way, kept a binder on the kitchen shelf labeled just in case, with every account number, every insurance document, every password written in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. That binder was her final gift to me. Our son, Nathan, grown 34, working in commercial real estate in Nashville, had married a woman named Fiona about 4 years prior. Fiona was polished. That's the word I always used. Polished like a showroom floor. Beautiful surface, nothing underneath that stuck to you. She worked in marketing, knew how to enter a room, knew how to make you feel chosen when she was talking to you. I'd watched her do it at every family dinner. Watch the target, find the angle, apply pressure where it was soft. I didn't dislike her. I want to be clear about that. I tried hard not to. Nathan loved her, and Nathan was a good man. He got his mother's patience and, I'll admit, a little too much of my tendency to trust people who smiled at the right moments. The first time Fiona asked me for money was 18 months after the wedding. Not directly. Fiona never did anything directly. She mentioned over a Sunday lunch that they were looking at a house in Franklin, great school district, values going up, and the down payment was just a stretch. She looked at me while she was talking, not Nathan. That told me everything. I wrote the check. $15,000. Nathan called me that evening, genuinely grateful, embarrassed even. Said they'd pay it back in installments. I told him not to worry about it. Family doesn't keep score. I meant it. The second ask came 8 months later. Nathan's car needed replacing, and Fiona's lease was up, and they were hemorrhaging money on rentals. Her word, hemorrhaging. 12,000. I wrote that check too. Told myself the same thing. My wife's health was sliding by then. Some weeks she knew me completely. Other weeks she'd look at me from across the breakfast table, like she was trying to place a face from a dream. I was spending most of my time at home with her, which meant I wasn't paying as close attention to other things as I should have been. That's on me. I've made peace with it, mostly. The third request didn't come from Fiona. It came from my son, which was worse. He sat across from me at my kitchen table. His mother was sleeping. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and he looked like a man who'd been told what to say and rehearsed it twice. He needed 20,000 investment opportunity. A friend of Fiona's family had a short-term fund, guaranteed 12% return, 60-day window. He slid a printed document across the table with letterhead on it. It looked real. I told him I needed to think about it. I called my financial advisor the next morning. He told me to run. When I called Nathan back and said no, he took it quietly. Fiona did not. She called me that same evening, told me I was holding them back, that his mother, my wife, would want them to succeed, that I was sitting on a paid-off house and retirement accounts while they struggled. Her voice stayed even the whole time. No screaming. Just cold, precise words arranged to make me feel small. I said, "Fiona, I'm going to let that go because you're frustrated. But I'd appreciate it if you called back when you're ready to talk like family." She hung up. Nathan didn't call for 11 days. When he did, he sounded tired. Said Fiona hadn't meant it. Said she was stressed. I said I understood and I loved him and we moved on. That's what you do. My wife passed in March of last year. Home hospice the way she wanted. Nathan and Fiona were there, which I was grateful for. Nathan held his mother's hand and cried like the boy I remembered. Fiona stood near the window and looked at her phone twice, and I noticed both times and said nothing. The week after the funeral, I was barely functional. I went through motions, thank you notes, casseroles from neighbors, death certificates, all of it on autopilot. I asked Fiona if she could help me get my wife's secondary checking account closed. My wife had kept a separate account for household management, an old habit from before we combined finances, and it still had a balance. I had power of attorney. I just needed someone to drive me to the bank because I wasn't fit to drive. Fiona said, of course. She drove me, walked in with me, sat beside me at the banker's desk. I had all the paperwork. The banker processed everything, confirmed the balance, $22,400, and asked where I wanted it transferred. I said my primary checking. There was a pause. I looked up. The banker's expression hadn't changed, but she was looking at her screen with the kind of careful blankness that means something is wrong. She said she needed a moment and excused herself. Fiona, next to me, said nothing. She was looking at her phone. The bank manager came back and asked to speak with me privately. Fiona said she'd wait outside. I followed the manager to a small office. He closed the door. The account had been accessed 4 days ago. Online transfer. The money, all 22,000, had been moved to an external account. The transfer had been authorized using my wife's login credentials. My wife had been dead for 6 days at that point. I sat in that office for a long time. The manager was talking. I heard words: fraud, investigation, report, possibly recoverable. I nodded at the right moments. Outside, through the glass, I could see Fiona on her phone, one hand gesturing, walking small circles on the sidewalk. Looking at her, you'd think she was scheduling a hair appointment. I drove myself home. I told the manager I needed 24 hours before filing anything. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. At home, I opened my wife's binder. I went through every account. Everything else was intact. Just that one. The one she'd mentioned to Fiona once at a family dinner when she was still sharp enough to talk about their finances with pride. I remembered that dinner. Fiona had asked questions, interested, engaged questions. I'd thought it was warm. I called my attorney the next morning, a woman I'd used for estate planning named Harriet. I laid out everything I knew. She listened without interrupting, which told me it wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this. She said, don't confront her. Don't mention the account. Don't transfer anything. Don't change any passwords. Don't post anything. Don't tell Nathan yet. I said, she took money from my wife's account. My wife had been dead less than a week. Harriet said, I know, and we are going to handle it correctly. I asked her what correctly looked like. She said, patience. Patience is hard at 63 when your chest feels like concrete and you're eating cereal for dinner because your wife of 41 years is gone and her daughter-in-law stole from her grave. I was patient anyway. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of quiet. Fiona texted me twice. Checking in, she called it, a heart emoji at the end of each message. Nathan called on Sundays like he always did. I asked about their week, asked about the dog, asked about the dog, asked about the project he'd mentioned in Franklin. Normal conversation. My voice didn't shake. My wife used to say I could run sound for a poker tournament. She meant it as a compliment. Harriet worked fast. The bank's fraud team traced the transfer to an account opened 3 months prior at a different institution, under Fiona's maiden name. The login access had been possible because Fiona, during that first bank visit months ago, when she'd driven me for a routine errand, had watched me enter my wife's credentials. My wife had trusted me to manage it from her device. I hadn't thought twice about it. Harriet also found something else. Through the fraud investigator the bank hired, they discovered this wasn't Fiona's first time. There was a woman in Brentwood, the mother of Fiona's college roommate, who'd had a similar experience, elderly, recently widowed, had trusted Fiona with some account navigation assistance during a hard month. $12,000 missing. The woman had been too ashamed to press charges. Told herself she might have made an error. That's what people do when they trust someone and get taken. They doubt themselves first. I stopped doubting myself around day 10. Harriet filed the criminal complaint on a Thursday. Felony elder financial abuse, a specific charge under Tennessee state law, which carries real weight. The fraud team at the bank filed their own report simultaneously. The DA's office contacted me by the following Monday. Nathan didn't know yet. That was the part that kept me up at night. My son. He loved this woman. He'd built a life next to her. He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who'd picked badly and didn't know it yet. I'd been where he was once, before I learned how to read people. Some lessons take longer than others. I'd been telling Fiona, when she texted, that I was doing fine. Sorting through your mother's things. Slow going, she replied with supportive phrases that meant nothing. Perfect responses with no actual content. I'd gotten good at recognizing that. On a Wednesday, about 3 weeks after the funeral, I called Nathan. Not about any of this. Just to talk. Halfway through the call, I asked if Fiona was around. She wasn't. He said she was out with a friend. I said, "Good. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without her in the room." He went quiet in that way. That means a person is both bracing and hoping they've misread the situation. I said, "I need you to come to Knoxville this weekend. Just you." He came Saturday morning. I had coffee made. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd slid me that fake investment printout, and I laid it out. All of it. The bank account, the transfer date, the amount, the maiden name account, the Brentwood woman, Harriet's filing, the DAA's office. I put printed documents in front of him as I talked. Harriet had prepared them for exactly this purpose. Organized, dated, clear. Nathan didn't speak for a long time after I finished. He picked up one page, put it down. Picked up another. Finally, he said, "This isn't possible." I said, "I know that's what it feels like." She wouldn't. He stopped, restarted. "Mom's account?" "Yes." "Mom had been dead 6 days." "Yes." He put his elbows on the table and covered his face with both hands. I let him sit there. There's no shortcut through that moment. A man finding out his marriage was built on something rotten doesn't need to be hurried. He needs to be let alone in it for a minute. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He asked me what I needed from him. I said nothing yet, just to know. He drove back to Nashville that afternoon. I didn't hear from him for 2 days. Then he called and said he'd spoken to an attorney of his own. Said he'd spent those 2 days going through their accounts, their credit cards, old transfers, found things he'd explained away separately that now made a pattern when laid beside each other. He said, "How long have you known something was off?" I said, "Long enough." He said he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. The envelope came together over the following week. Harriet assembled it. The formal criminal complaint, the bank's fraud report, the transfer records, the documentation tying the account to Fiona's name. She included the statement from the Brentwood woman, who'd agreed to go on record once she learned she wasn't alone. She included a summary from the DA's office confirming the charges. I drove to Nashville on a Tuesday. Nathan was at work, by design. I texted Fiona that I wanted to stop by, drop off some of your mother's things I thought you might want. She texted back immediately. "Of course, come anytime." She met me at the door in walkout clothes, fresh from something, that professional smile already deployed. She saw the manila envelope under my arm, and her eyes moved to it for just a second before coming back to my face. She said, "Is that for me?" I said, "It is." She took it, started to open it right there at the door. That same expression, slight anticipation, already composing her reaction. I watched her read the first page. The smile didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved in stages, like ice in water you're watching but not touching. She looked up at me. I said, "Page 3 has the court date." She said, "This is insane. You can't prove." I said, "The account is in your maiden name. The transfer happened from your IP address. The bank has the records." Her voice dropped, went careful. "Silas, we can work this out. Nathan doesn't need to know about any." I said, "Nathan knows. He's known for 2 weeks." She went still the way people go, still when the floor drops. I said, "My wife trusted this family. She trusted you. She died 6 days before you took her money." I left before she could answer. Walked to my truck, backed out of the driveway, drove to the end of their street, and sat for a moment with the engine running. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. Nothing like this ever is. Fiona retained a criminal defense attorney who moved fast and loud, the kind that files motions the way other people clear their throats. The counter-narrative was that I'd mishandled the estate, that there was confusion over accounts, that Fiona had believed she was authorized. It was creative. It was also contradicted on 4 separate points by the bank's own records. Nathan moved out of their house the same week the charges were filed. He took the dog and 3 boxes and called me from a parking lot at 10 o'clock at night. I stayed on the phone with him for an hour and a half. We talked about his mother, about the early years, about a fishing trip we'd taken when he was 11 in the Smokies, and he'd caught a trout bigger than anything I'd ever pulled up, and couldn't stop laughing about it for 2 days. We didn't solve anything that night, but he sounded less alone by the end of it, and so did I. The woman from Brentwood, I'll call her Helen because she asked me to use a different name, testified in the preliminary hearing via written statement. Her 12,000 had been taken the same way, same timing, same method. She'd been embarrassed into silence for 2 years. When I called to thank her for coming forward, she said, "I thought I was losing my mind, thinking I'd made an error. Thank you for making it real." I thought about my wife for a long time after that call, about how she would have felt knowing another woman had carried that confusion alone. The hearing was held in Davidson County. I sat in a courtroom that smelled like recycled air and old paperwork and watched Fiona's attorney perform confident uncertainty, which is a very specific legal art form. The DA's team presented the records, the transfer timestamp, the account documents, Helen's statement. Nathan from the third row watched the screen showing his wife's maiden name on a fraudulent account and didn't move once. The judge found probable cause. Trial date set. Fiona pled no contest 4 weeks before trial. Her attorney had apparently done the math. The bank records were what they were. The plea included full restitution of the 22,000 plus Helen's 12 plus court costs. She received 36 months probation, mandatory financial crime counseling, and a permanent mark on her record. No jail time. I won't pretend that didn't sit hard for about a week. But Harriet reminded me of something my wife used to say, actually, that the point of standing up isn't always to knock someone down. Sometimes it's just to make clear you're standing. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Nathan did not fight it. He told me once that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, but realizing how long he'd been adjusting himself to fit around something that wasn't real. I recognize that. A lot of people do, I think, when they finally name it. He's in Knoxville now, renting an apartment 20 minutes from me. We have dinner on Thursdays. He brings the dog, a retriever mix named Hatch, who takes up most of my couch and has no opinions about legal proceedings. I appreciate that in a dog. I went back to volunteering at the woodworking co-op on Saturdays, something I'd stopped doing when my wife got sick and never restarted. First Saturday back, a man I'd known for years looked at my face and said, "You look like someone who's been through something." I said, "That's about right." He handed me a piece of walnut and said, "Start there." So I did. Helen sent me a card last Christmas. Handwritten, short. Said she finally closed the account she'd opened to replace the one Fiona had accessed, because she'd been too afraid to touch it for 2 years. Said closing it felt like putting something down she didn't know she was still carrying. I know that feeling. I've been setting things down slowly, the way you do when you've been holding them too long, and your hands have forgotten what empty feels like. My wife's binder is still on the kitchen shelf. I've updated it, added new passwords, new account information, a note for Nathan about what's where and what goes to whom. Her handwriting is still on the first pages. I don't plan to remove it. Some things you keep because they meant something. Some things you keep because someone earned being remembered. She earned it. I keep thinking about the moment I sat in that bank manager's office, watching Fiona through the glass, walking circles on the sidewalk, phone to her ear, completely unbothered. My wife had been gone 6 days, and I remember thinking, not with rage, just with a cold kind of clarity, that everything I was seeing made sense now. Every ask, every angle, every smile deployed at exactly the right second. It all had a logic to it. I just hadn't wanted to read it. That's the part that stays with me. Not what she did, what I almost let myself not see. There's something people don't talk about enough when it comes to being taken advantage of. How much the betrayal depends on your own willingness to explain it away. Fiona didn't fool me with cleverness. She fooled me with my own decency. I wanted to believe the best of the woman my son loved. That's not weakness. But leaving that belief unexamined, letting it sit there unchallenged while evidence quietly piled up, that's where I failed myself. Knowing the difference between trust and willful blindness is something I'm still working on, honestly. At 63, I'm still learning where that line is. What I got right was what came after. When Harriet told me to be patient, to document, to say nothing, I listened. Every instinct I had wanted to walk back into that house and demand an answer. I didn't. That discipline, that willingness to sit in discomfort and work the problem slowly, is what made the difference between justice and just noise. I thought about what would have happened if I'd confronted Fiona at the bank that day. She'd have lawyered up before sundown. The money might never have been traced. She'd have moved on to the next family. Patience isn't passive. Patience, when it's intentional, is the sharpest tool you have. And I think about Nathan, about how hard it must have been to sit across from me at that kitchen table, reading those documents, watching his marriage dissolve page by page. He didn't run from it. He picked up the phone, found his own attorney, went through his own accounts, found his own evidence. That took something real. The willingness to face a hard truth about someone you love, instead of building a story around why it couldn't be true. I'm proud of him for that. I don't know if I would have done it faster at his age. What Fiona miscalculated ultimately was that she'd been working a system. Identify the soft spot, apply pressure, collect, move on. She'd done it before. She expected it to work the same way again. What she didn't account for was that grief changes people in ways that are hard to predict. I came out of losing my wife quieter, slower, more deliberate. She came at me expecting someone softened by loss. She got someone clarified by it. My wife's handwriting is still on the first pages of that binder. I'm not going to change that. Some things you hold on to, not because you can't let go, but because they remind you who you're supposed to be. She was the most honest person I ever knew. The least I could do was act like it. I hope, if you're watching this and something in this story sounds familiar, a request that felt slightly off, a person who smiled a little too precisely, I hope you trust that feeling. Write it down. Document it. Talk to someone who knows the law. You don't have to be dramatic about it. You just have to be clear-eyed enough to see what's in front of you, honest enough with yourself to name it, and steady enough to do something about it without losing who you are in the process. That's all any of us can do.